on the panel for
Thank you.
the professional investor funds, Dr. Joseph Gio and Dr. Luis de Gabriele. Yeah, we know that the structure of professional investor funds exists some of a kind here in Malta. We have certain similar structures in other jurisdictions like Luxembourg and Ireland. Would you just give us a brief overview now compared to standardized structures like a usage? What are the main differences to this kind of fund structure which is available here in Malta?
One major advantage that I think PIFs would have in this respect is that rather than being having the underlying assets having to be transferable securities, they can be commodities, they can be anything else, which falls much better into the requirements of Sharia compliant funds in terms of the general principles, at least. Mm-hmm. In terms also of the restrictions that apply to professional investor funds, they are much less, and therefore if there are any restrictions that need to be imposed, they can be self-imposed by the fund managers or by the fund promoters, but that they are not regulatory restrictions, so it allows more flexibility probably than UCITS in being used as a vehicle for Sharia compliant funds.
Maybe a question on the structure itself. What we have seen is that there are certain different type of funds that are available. Could you please tell us what difference is in between the three types?
Okay.
That people get an overview on it.
If we see that Islamic funds have, in Europe, particularly gravitated towards Luxembourg and Ireland, and if we look at our Maltese framework, the Maltese framework for alternative funds, and therefore, and this is where PIFs come in, is very similar to that in both Luxembourg with specialized investment funds and in Ireland with qualifying investor funds. These are not meant at a retail market, both of them are meant at a professional investor market. And the fact that Islamic funds have worked and are working in Dublin and in Luxembourg proves that they can also work in Malta, because essentially we're looking at the same basic regulatory framework. Having said that, there are some distinguishing features between the regulatory framework in Malta as far as professional funds is concerned and that in Luxembourg and in Dublin, which in my view, even though we still haven't seen Islamic funds come to Malta, will contribute to making Malta attractive for Islamic investors. And these are essentially the same which have driven the success of Malta as a fund domicile. Essentially, the accessibility of the regulator, the relatively lower cost structure, and in the case of Islamic funds, our historical and cultural background, which can perhaps engage more with North Africa and the Middle East than places like Luxembourg and Dublin. But very quickly, our PIF framework is divided into three categories of PIFs. One is aimed at what we call experienced investors, where the entry threshold and the minimum investment would be 10,000 euros. And in that case, the fund would be subject to some investment restrictions and to leverage restrictions as well. Moving up to funds targeting what we call qualifying investors, where the minimum investment would be 75,000 euros or equivalent in any other currency, where there would be no investment restrictions. The PIF targeting qualifying investors would not need to appoint a custodian each and every time, as long as the regulator is satisfied that there are suitable safekeeping arrangements for the assets of the fund. The third type of PIF that we have in Malta is that targeting extraordinary investors, where the minimum investment would have to be 750,000 euros. Here again, we can see, although perhaps may not necessarily have a big effect on attracting funds to Malta, that the threshold for investing in, for example, qualifying investor funds in Malta is set at 75,000 euros, which is much lower than the 250,000 euros, which is applicable for QIFs in Ireland, or the 125,000 euros for SIFs in Luxembourg. And that means that if a fund promoter is trying to attract an investor base where the minimum investment where the investors may not be able to or may not be willing to invest as up to 250,000 euros as a minimum, Malta can tick that box and therefore present an advantage over other jurisdictions. Something else that distinguishes, at least until 2017, where the AIFMD directive will change things from other jurisdictions, is that unlike Luxembourg and unlike Dublin, Malta does not require the appointment of local service providers. So a Maltese fund may not need, is not required to appoint a custodian or a manager in Malta, which is the case in Ireland as far as managers and custodians are concerned, or in Luxembourg, where you must necessarily appoint a custodian from Luxembourg.
You speak about the different jurisdictions and, of course, the types of investors. What we have seen, especially in the three markets, I think Luxembourg and Malta are quite similar in terms of numbers of funds, almost 300.
Not the asset size, though.
Not the asset size, of course. And what we've seen is Ireland is wide below in terms of numbers of funds with 150, almost half of it.
That is not counting the sub-funds, probably.
Definitely, yeah. What type of investors would you see, especially coming from that GCC or Islamic sphere, would fit best to this kind of structure of investments? What have you seen so far would be able to, what kind of type of investors is actually interesting for that fund?
The PIF environment we are aware of, and I think a lot of the people here would like to understand really how that PIF environment can be more adaptable and can be more attractive to attract Sharia compliant funds. And at least from some research I've done, it seems that the relative size of these funds, particularly their asset base, not the number of funds, because that's relative, is because rather than the way it's done in Europe and the US, where funds tend to be promoted by a fund manager or a fund promoter, and they are incubated within that fund promoter and then sold out and distributed, it is more likely that it's family offices or institutional investors that have a presence in Europe already who are sending out mandates to fund managers. And they have loads of fund managers in the rest of Europe and the US who are vying for these mandates. So I would see that the natural investors, or rather the natural promoters and investors in these funds, will be family offices, wealthy families already having a presence somewhere within Europe. From your perspective now, why do you think that it is only that the source of these funds, even the way it's developed so far in Europe, if my information is correct, is that rather than having these bigger funds with a huge asset base, it is smaller funds where the asset base is relatively small next to other bigger funds we are used to. Why they are the source of these investments, how the fund comes to be by having a wealthy family or a family office that actually mandates a fund manager to manage a certain amount of funds, and in which assets.
You have shown us in the previous slide how small the Islamic funds universe is when compared to the Islamic finance generally. And one of the reasons for that is that the sovereign funds themselves of Islamic states are not themselves investing into Islamic investments, because that is limiting, of course, the amount of return that they can get. And because of that, not only sovereign funds are not investing into Islamic funds, but Islamic institutions themselves. So the big institutional investors in the Middle East are not investing their funds into Sharia compliant funds, but are seeking return rather than compliance with Sharia as a first instance. So it is still too early to see how Islamic funds can grow until we start seeing the masses of investments growing to justify new players coming in.
I mean, if you look on the drivers that promotes or develops that kind of volume in terms of Islamic funds, first of all, we must know that in the region, when money got invested, at the moment we have a ratio in 70% in conventional banking and 30% into Islamic banking, when we look only into the GCC region. Nonetheless, what we have seen through research by McKinsey and other companies, this ratio will be closed up to 50-50 within the next 20 years. A lot of investors have seen that their belief is going into that way, and their investments are running into the other way. This is one certain driver. The next driver, what we have seen as well, when we speak about, especially about that wealthy sovereign funds, they're actually not set it up as a Sharia-compliant Islamic institute. They're investing into any kind of non-Islamic investments, whether directly or through financial vehicles. So it's not by definition that a sovereign fund who sits in Abu Dhabi, the IDIB, or Kuwait Finance House is investing only in Sharia-compliant products. But nevertheless, a third interesting driver, what we see, if we have a look on the structure of the investors or people who are able to set up funds or to set up certain financial products. On one hand, you have the financial services provider by themselves. If a certain bank or Islamic bank says, yes, we would like to set up a fund, some of them have done that only in the region. Most of them are actually governmental owned. So when you speak to them and tell them how are you interested to set up funds in terms of Islamic funds or refinance yourself, they tell you refinancing is not an issue for us. So there are certain movements and drivers which shows that the actual investors might be family office, wealthy people, but especially these kind of investors who already have investments here in the region, in Europe, direct or indirect. But nevertheless, more and more people who only are concentrated on the region are interested to look outside of the region. We have a lot of clients who give us a call and tell us, look, due to the movements at the moment, I live here, but I like to reduce my portfolio in this region because I don't know where it's going. Let's move to old economy. And then old economy means Europe, includes Malta, and then it might be interested also to be ready for these kind of people to have that structure available.